Hello YouTube, and we'll be talking about Prohibition. In this series, the concept of a full ban of guns and drugs. But first, guns. Now, before we get started, I'm going to tell you my agenda, so you can understand where this video will be coming from. And that's very important in the Prohibition debate, because most people I meet enter the argument with an agenda. Normally, people I meet on both sides decided their sides prior to looking at any evidence. Then they search for statistics that support their argument. And I regularly catch people on both sides concealing or discarding evidence that doesn't support their point of view. At that point, people aren't open to objective reasoning. For example, those against gun prohibition have given me a quote from World War II Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, who said, "You cannot invade mainland United States, there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." And as far as I am aware, this quote is fake. Invading the mainland United States was never a valid military strategy, and it had nothing to do with citizenry being armed or not. The Japanese didn't have the resources to conduct a land invasion, and it was never considered plausible. Gun prohibition, or the lack thereof, was an irrelevant point. Vice versa, from those in favor of gun prohibition, I often receive falsified or deceptive statistics. For example, they'll point to Britain and say, "They have gun control, they're so much more peaceful than the United States. Look at the gun violence stats." And then they leave out the information about what Britain's actual violent crime rate is, which is in fact 350% that of the United States, according to homeoffice.gov.uk. I don't like it when people try to withhold information from me or deceive me to get me to support their argument. But everyone has an agenda. So what's mine? I want to see how far the human race can really go, and want a civilization that is suited for such a goal. So with that in mind, when I consider Prohibition, I look at it from a nation-building standpoint. If I select Prohibition and add it to my nation, will it provide my civilization with a profit? Will I gain more from having it than I will lose? Because humans are inherently free, they don't follow rules. However, rules are imposed when large groups of humans come together to form societies. And the idea is that if everyone agrees to play by certain rules, the whole group and everyone in it will benefit. We agree not to rape and murder, and in return we get things like rule of law. And by having societies, it means not everyone needs to be self-sufficient for survival. Where everyone would be a hunter-gatherer, we can now have doctors and scientists. We are offered medical and technological advancements to increase our lifespans. We agree to obey certain rules, and we all profit from doing so. That's the idea, at least. But this means that prohibition is not a natural concept. We don't have a list where everything is illegal and certain things become made legal. It's the other way around. Our rules are created to serve some sort of purpose. Therefore, when I'm considering prohibition, prohibition has to justify its existence to me. It isn't the default position, so it must offer my civilization something that will be worth the costs of imposing it and enforcing it. So my question is, does gun or drug prohibition do that? Now this viewpoint again cancels out points both in favor of prohibition and against it. I'm regularly given the argument of the Second Amendment for the United States as a reason to have firearms, and that argument means little to me. The nation I want to build is not based specifically off the United States, so traditional American values don't get special treatment. Vice versa, I'm regularly presented the argument that America should be more like the so-called civilized Western nations that adopt gun prohibition, as if having gun prohibition is some sort of mark of being civilized and actually worth bragging rights. That argument also holds no weight to me. Just because all the cool kids do it doesn't mean it's a good idea. Just because all the cool kids have meth addictions doesn't mean that I should have a meth addiction. No, I'm not going to give one nation favoritism, and I'm not going to follow all the lemmings off a cliff either. This is based on objective reasoning. So let's start with guns. There are several different categories, such as crime rates and financial costs, but for this video, we'll ask, what are the long-term effects on a nation's citizenry? Now, you can't actually prohibit guns, because guns are required for enforcement of gun prohibition. Without them, the rule defaults to being unenforceable. So practically speaking, you can only split your citizenry into two classes. Class A, who have firearms, comprised of military, police, and government, and Class B, comprised of everyone else. Now this influences certain standards of behavior. In order to rationalize that Class A should have guns and Class B should not, you need to justify why. Saying that Class B doesn't need them is a fallacious rationalization, because as I said earlier, prohibition isn't the natural state for humans. You need to give me a reason for Class B not to have them to justify going out of my way to impose prohibition on them. Typically, this reason will be that Class A is going to use guns for better purposes and more responsibly than Class B, whereas Class B citizens are not qualified, and the performance of Class B is so poor, Class B citizens should be restricted from access to firearms. While that is a sound rationalization, if that is an accurate assessment of the competence of the average Class B citizen, this creates a problem, that being low standards of behavior. Consider asking, why are Class B citizens not qualified? Why are they so much more inferior than Class A citizens? Because this isn't a small gap. Consider the behavior implications that set in from this over the course of a few hundred years. If you've restricted Class B from the ability to have a firearm, you also revoke their responsibility for use of said firearm to accomplish good things. By saying that a Class A has a certain level of competence and responsibility, and therefore may have firearms, but a Class B does not get firearms, you infer that a Class B is not capable of performing the tasks and responsibilities of a Class A, not just less effectively, but not at all. And this must be the case to justify revoking their access to weapons. As such, the Class B doesn't inherit the same responsibilities. In the Sandy Hook shooting, 20 kids died, but the victims less people talk about are the adults that died while attempting to save the children or engage the shooter in combat. If these adults that were killed would be Class B citizens, that means they would have had no responsibility to enter into a life-threatening situation, because that's a responsibility for Class A citizens. That means that the correct course of action for an adult is to flee the scene in interest of one's own survival, leaving the children behind, without concern for their casualty rate, unless the children can be saved without any potential risk to the adult. Them placing themselves at risk for the benefit of others would be a trait of Class A citizens, and thus a Class A responsibility. This course of action would not only be acceptable, but also expected. It is not your responsibility to help them, it is not your responsibility to attempt to save them, if doing so would place you in a potentially life-threatening situation. Because only a Class A is allowed equipment for such a situation, it is something only a Class A has a responsibility to do. The only way around this is to impose a double standard that expects, if not requires, Class A performance from Class B citizens, but does not extend Class A equipment, supplies, safeties, or support. To expect the Class B citizen to enter into life-risking scenarios, which they have been deemed unqualified for and have had their equipment access revoked as a result, they've now been artificially made significantly less effective at performing that task. If I've been told I'm not qualified to stop a mugging, and I'm not allowed access to equipment to halt muggings, the sensible thing for me to do is not to stop muggings, especially considering that if I attempt it now, my chances for success are much smaller, and concern for the victim becomes secondary. I personally perceive both freeing adults from responsibility as well as imposing the double standard to be social failures. I want a civilization where if an incident happens in the street, it is the responsibility of nearby citizens to address the issue. Now you can actually get around the problem of throwing the kids to the wolves by stationing Class A citizens in areas to defend the Class Bs. For example, instead of arming teachers, station military to guard schools as a way to provide jobs for returning servicemen, as well as provide security. That might help with the school shootings issue a bit. However, this doesn't address the second half of the problem, that the standards of behavior are reduced. You cannot station Class A's everywhere to protect every Class B. This is a practical impossibility, unless you have enough soldiers or police to secure every location a Class B will inhabit. This also assumes that Class A's and the governing body they support have low risk of corruption, and assumes that their failure rate is low enough to be an improvement, or better than that of a nation where Class B is armed, requiring the conclusion that Class A's exclusive access to firearms will lead to a better standard of living for the nation's people. But more on that in the crime rate video. Ask yourself, what happens in a crowded theater when someone starts shooting? Or, for a non-gun related example, what happens in a crowded building when there's a fire? One possible result is mass panic, chaos, and some people being trampled to death. This is not acceptable to me, and that behavior will not be tolerated in a nation of my design. If these scenarios were responded to by the large group rationally, casualties would be significantly lower. I believe that this is an obtainable goal to socially engineer, because it's been demonstrated to me that the goal has been obtained by certain groups already. To prepare people for situations where lives are at risk, be it medical or military, a common philosophy is that panicking is one of the worst things you could do, making you a hazard to others and yourself. In my view, people panic because they are afraid. They are afraid because fear is clouding their better reasoning skills, which would otherwise be providing them better odds of survival. When I received my CPR training, I learned that no matter how badly your patient is doing, you're supposed to do your best to calm them down and tell them that they'll be fine and that their injuries aren't bad. And I learned that this will increase their chances for survival. And for those of you who have been subscribed to my channel long enough to know about my hospitalization and near death, my odds were pretty bad, but they would have been worse had I panicked and not handled the situation rationally. Had I failed, that negligence could have cost me. Consider this. You have two movie theaters, both catch fire. One is full of military veterans, the other is full of random people, but lacks anyone trained for pressure scenarios. Which of these two will run the risk of trampling people to death? The consensus seems to be that panic is bad, but can be removed with training and preparation. Taking that, combined with personal experience from CPR training and my own life-threatening experience, I must conclude that panic and fear are, mostly, caused because people are unprepared, untrained, uneducated, and inexperienced. And the responsibility for this lies at the feet of the educational system, which should be training citizens. Therefore, my solution is not to lower the bar so that a Class B is held to a lower standard, which is what Prohibition would impose and would be like saying that panicking in a theater and trampling people to death is acceptable, but my solution is to reform the educational system to bring them up to the Class A standard. This means more education, training to act under pressure scenarios, teaching people not to panic, teaching people to react to dangerous situations responsibly, as well as to responsibly own firearms when they reach adulthood, and imposing responsibilities on them in turn. This would be added in as part of the educational curriculum, probably starting in high school or middle school. Conclusion. When it comes to the specific category of its long-term effects on a society, gun prohibition provides a loss and not a benefit, by lowering the levels of expected responsibility from each citizen. It isn't the only factor capable of raising or lowering standards, and one could socially engineer a nation that has gun prohibition where most citizens behave reasonably and react to danger rationally, such as avoiding panic in a theater fire, or selflessly, as the adult victims in Sandy Hook. Vice versa, a nation with no gun prohibition can have much lower standards based on other outside circumstances. But for a citizenry that meets a high level of responsibility normally, gun prohibition becomes pointless, since prohibition would exist to keep guns away from those who are below that standard, and you'd be disarming a majority of responsible people and a minority of legitimate threats. This means that prohibition is effectively a band-aid, serving no purpose once your citizenry advances to a certain level. So most of the time, you either have a case where prohibition is damaging, or prohibition is unneeded and therefore pointless. You can outweigh the negatives of prohibition when it comes to the behavior standards, but the effects prohibition of firearms has on a citizenry are usually negative. So the next step is to examine things like its impact on crime rate, which can in turn affect death rate, and its financial enforceability, which can affect practicality. Both of these tie more into drug prohibition, so we need to see if these other categories can provide enough of a benefit to overcome this loss. To an extent, this will be subject to opinion. Some people will have their own ideal of a nation they envision, and the losses here may be acceptable or otherwise compensated for if other categories can provide benefits that that person considers for their civilization to be a good trade. But in this category, it does provide a loss. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Future Prohibition videos will examine its other categories, and I hope you enjoyed the review. Later, YouTube.